From Toronto, this is JWeekly Canada, starring Ieden Wall and Susan Minuk. From Studio 18, here is Susan Minuk.
Welcome to the studio, Rabbi Levi Gansburg.
Thank you, Susan, for having me.
Nice to see you. How am I going to address you? Rabbi Levi, Rabbi Gansburg?
Yeah, Rabbi Levi's fine.
Because that's how I address you.
Yeah, most people address me that way. Is there any right way?
Yeah. Okay. So, you and I, we go back to 2007 when you first opened your Chabad on Bayview, in a house on Bayview in York Mills. We first met. That's when we became acquainted.
Yeah.
And fast track to today, and you have a beautiful shul with more than 500 families with educational and all kinds of school programs and social programs, and it's wonderful to see the growth, and I'm really proud.
Well, thank you so much, and everything that Rivki and I have built from the ground up was really in a partnership with everybody that has come and attended and supported, and it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to build a community, so we're grateful.
So I want to talk about Chabad, okay, because not everybody knows what the Chabad movement is, so maybe you can start with that.
Sure. The Chabad movement, in its history, is some 250 years old. It's a philosophy and a way of life. It's part of the Hasidic movement, which focuses on faith of God, joy, and the love of a fellow. I mean, that's the general overview of the Hasidic movement. The Chabad movement, in its philosophy, has a little bit more of an intellectual spin, prying and trying to understand who God is, why He created a world, and where we fit into this picture. In the last couple of, since 1950, the Rebbe of blessed memory has taken the Chabad movement and flipped it inside out to build it into a movement of kindness and education, not just to the people from within the community, but to every Jewish person, wherever they are.
Okay, so maybe you can define what Chabad means exactly, what it stands for.
Sure. So Chabad is comprised of three Hebrew letters, Chet, Bet, and Daled, which stands for Chachma, Bina, and Dad. And in English that translates as wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. And it takes the essence of the Hasidic movement, but it then pries at it in an intellectual form. To really understand who God is, it's one of the precepts of the Torah, to understand who God is, to try to understand why we're in this world and what our duty and our mandate is in this world. So in summation, Chabad is an intellectual pursuit of a way of life, of meaning, of purpose, of godliness and sanctity.
So I want to talk for a few minutes about the Rebbe. So why was he such a spiritual, great leader?
So the Rebbe was a leader par excellence, and it's funny that the Rebbe didn't really want to take the helm of leadership. He actually resisted it for an entire year after his predecessor, his father-in-law, passed away.
May I ask you to just name him?
Sure. So the Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Schneerson, who passed away in 1994, we're coming up on his 29th yahrzeit in less than a week. I don't know if that's relevant to this. But the Rebbe was a leader on so many levels. But I think if I had to break it down, I would say the Rebbe was a leader of empowerment, not of power. Many leaders look for power and control. And the Rebbe spent his entire life looking to uplift and empower people to see the leadership quality within themselves. He believed in people more possibly than they believed in themselves. And it was a decentralized form. He didn't want people to lean on him. He wanted them to glean the fundamentals of Judaism and Torah from his teachings, but then to take it and make it their own wherever and however they need to implement it. And that was, I'd say, one key issue. Another thing was the Rebbe loved every Jew. He loved people, period. He had faith in humanity. He looked at every Jew as his responsibility. And in empowering people, he really wanted them to do that too, to think globally, even if you're in a specific local area, to think that every Jew, whether you're on a plane, you're in a restaurant, you're at the pulpit, whatever you're doing, you have to take responsibility for everyone you come in contact with. And that's what made him unique, I think, in some way. And finally, I think the Rebbe was an anomaly in terms of a Hasidic leader. On the one hand, one hand was way beyond the world. He was steeped in the words of Torah and mysticism and Talmud. And yet on the other hand, he had a hand well in the world. He had his finger on the pulse of what the classic American Jew or a global Jew needed, what was needed for them. And he tried to merge those two worlds by uplifting the Jew closer to Torah and also bringing the Torah closer to the Jew where they themselves needed at that moment.
Wow. So how did he become a pioneer in Jewish outreach?
So the Rebbe didn't create this idea on his own. He always talked that he was an extension of his predecessor, his father-in-law, Rabbi Joseph Schneerson, and the 6 preceding Rebbes, all the way to the founder of the Chabad movement, Reb Shneir Zalman.
Which was when?
Some 250 years ago.
Okay.
So at the end of the 18th, early 19th century. The Rebbe saw himself as an extension of that. The deep mystical ideas that were always applied and broadened by his father-in-law, both in communist Russia and later when he came in 1940 to America, the Rebbe then took that and broadened it to the point that it had to mean it literally. It applied to every one of his followers and anyone who would listen, and to do so with no strings attached, to do it from the heart, which means if we love someone and we want to take responsibility for them, it doesn't matter where you are, not in your religious state and not in your geographic state. We have to care for them. And that became a pioneering theme for a post-Holocaust generation where people were just looking to get back on their 2 feet. And the Rebbe asked young people to leave that stability that they just found and to go to far-flung corners of the world to care for the Jew that may not have a community.
And what do you think inspired him to focus on the global outreach?
The inspiration for the Rebbe's work was deeply mystical. On the one hand, he saw it as an extension of everything that we study and learn. It was a godly calling. But on the other hand, I'd say, in Hebrew we call it tzav hasha'a. The Rebbe saw it as the call of the generation. He was responding to the cry of the Jews post-Holocaust. That was his inspiration. Every Jew, whatever religious state they were, whatever geographic state they were, needed someone to put a hand around their shoulder and say, you belong. So he did so with meaning, with purpose, but he did it as a response to the call of his generation, and he asked his followers to do the same in their time, in each generation.
So, if I'm correct, the Rebbe used to hand out dollar bills to everyone he met. What was the meaning in that?
So historically, in the first few decades of his leadership, the Rebbe met with people one-on-one. But as the community grew and his reach grew, it just simply wasn't possible, so it stopped. But about a decade later, so many people wanted to meet the Rebbe, one-on-one, if you will, and the Rebbe said, let them come by and I'll see them. But the Rebbe always said that when 2 people come together, something good has to come out for a third. So he turned it into a moment of inspiration where it would have a ripple effect well beyond the meeting of these 2 people. And he said, if I give every person I meet a dollar bill for tzedakah, for charity, then our meeting wasn't just a frozen moment right here, but its ripple effect would happen. So, and of course, that's what ended up being. For years to come, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people would line up Sundays, including myself. I had many opportunities as a child to be able to meet the Rebbe as through the lens of a child. I had personal stories as well of the Rebbe's sensitivity to a child as I walked by around my birthday time. But the Rebbe wanted that when a moment happens, it shouldn't just be an isolated moment. It should be a timeless moment. And that's the beauty of tzedakah being such a cornerstone of Jewish thought and practice, that should be the offshoot of a meeting between 2 souls.
Wow, very, very special, very meaningful. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you, and thank you.
Very timely. So I found our conversation very fascinating, as our viewers will too, and thank you so much for being here, Rabbi Levi. A wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Susan, for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
You're watching Canadian Jewish Television. My name is Susan Minuk. We'll be right back.
Rina, it's so great to have you back here.
Thank you so much.
So wonderful.
It's an honor to be here again.
That's great. We always learn so much when you're here.
Thank you.
So, we're coming out of a post-COVID world, and it's been so tough on so many of us. So much anxiety, angst, worry, stress, feelings of vulnerability, things we've never really had before that we have to deal with now. Just curious, what does the Torah, what does Judaism say about self-care? Because it seems to be more important than ever.
Wow, what does the Torah say about self-care? So I don't know if it addresses it particularly the way that we're familiar with, right? Self-care, everything these days has become sort of like bubble baths and, glasses of wine and that sort
externals.
of thing. Yes, those sorts of things. But really Judaism values the idea of having a good relationship with oneself, really getting to know oneself, know who you are, what you stand for, what your values are, to really live within your integrity. And from there, we can sort of start expanding that out to being able to have good relationships with others and a good relationship with God as well. So we really see that self-knowledge, self-understanding, and self-love as a very critical part of life.
Right, so the knowledge of the self. So we know in the Torah, there's this idea of operating system in terms of knowledge, which is this idea of yetzers, like an inclination. Yetzer hatov, the inclination towards growth, good things, and yetzer hara, perhaps the inclination towards avoidance, procrastination, excuses. Tell us a little more about these yetzers, this operating system, so we can take better care of ourselves.
There's this idea that each one of us, when we were created, humanity as a whole, so God fashioned the atom out of the ground and then blew into the atom the living soul. So we have these two very different sort of sensibilities within us. We have this very physical, very temporal side of us, and we have this spiritual yearning in us as well. So when we look at the Yetzer HaTov, that tends to be really what's sort of drawing us up, drawing us to our highest self, to really live up to our potential. And our Yetzer Hara is more the one that's sort of like, no, you don't have to go that way, put it off till tomorrow, another 5 minutes, those sorts of things, getting in the way of us living up to the best selves that we can be. And so these two things are kind of always at play. And we're not always going to make the best decision. We're not always going to follow the Yetzer HaTov, but the idea is for that to be what leads and the Yetzer Hara to be the one that falls in line more often.
I see. So we obviously want to go with the Yetzer HaTov, which is more maximizing our potential.
Yeah.
The Yetzer Hara kind of sometimes gets in the way, says another 5 minutes, you can't necessarily make it, and might be too much. There's also this idea of chet, which is known as the idea of sin. But it doesn't translate so well into English, does it?
It doesn't at all. In fact, there's a verse in the book of Judges where it's talking about the stone slingers of Benjamin. This is how they used to fight once upon a time. And it says that they were able to sling a stone at a hair, velo yachti, right? So it's the same root word there, chet and yachti. So what was it? That they could sling a stone at a hair and not sin? That isn't what it was. It's that they didn't miss. So the idea of chet is, instead of really sin, which is all we have for it in English, is the idea of missing our mark. So that we have all these marks that we're supposed to hit in life, whether it's being honest, kind, compassionate, generous, living up to, fulfilling mitzvot and all those sorts of things. Those are the marks that we're supposed to hit.
Right.
And every now and then we have a chet where we miss the mark. And the thing is that instead of becoming so down on ourselves and dejected, generally speaking, when a person misses their mark, what they're supposed to do is sort of, refigure out their stance, take another look at the target, and shoot again.
Shoot again.
Yeah.
That's so interesting because many times Judaism was portrayed more in a negative way. I think it was Marx who actually said that religion is the opiate of the masses. And I think there's a case to be made that secularism is the opiate of the masses. in the sense this aggregation of materialism, wealth, status, esteem, I think that can lead to arrogance, which is sort of the way of the Yetzer Hara, when what we really need is self-esteem. Does Judaism say anything about the difference between self-esteem and arrogance? Is there a fine line there? Are there examples of arrogance?
We know from the Talmud and the Mishnah that arrogance really has no place, or a person who's arrogant, it's very difficult for them to make space for God to come in. And we do know the idea that where is God? God is wherever we let him in. And a person who is completely and totally full of themselves,
hubris.
Yes, can't make space. The other thing that we do understand, though, also is that self-esteem actually should be coming from the awareness of God. The most humble person that we ever hear about in all of the Torah is Moshe Rabbeinu, like Moses, the guy who led the Jewish people out of Egypt. When you think about it, he was like the greatest leader. How is it that he was the most humble? But what it was that he really knew who he was. He knew where everything that he had came from, and he knew what he was supposed to be doing with it. So he was able to have this humility of, yes, I am capable, and I am, I'm a leader, and all these sorts of things. They're God-given traits that I've worked on to develop, right? It's all about the partnership with God. Right. And I have these things in order to be able to do good for others and to act in this world on behalf of God as well. And so he never got like so full of himself that he was like, oh, look at me, I'm Moses, and this is what it's all about.
Right.
And so the idea of self-esteem is really, really, really knowing who you are, accepting yourself as a whole person, which means that sometimes you're going to make mistakes. You're not going to be perfect. And we see throughout the Torah that nobody was perfect. They all struggled. They all made mistakes, but they never let those mistakes define them. They kept going. They kept trying, and they always made space for God.
Rina, that is beautiful. On that beautiful, inspirational note, I'll thank you for being our guest here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I wanted you to talk about your poetry. And here's the reason why. I've never really been into poetry until this week. I heard you recite The Big Bang. And I invite everybody to look for Ieden's book, The Wisdom of Wall, because his poetry is phenomenal and penetrating, and in my mind, brilliant. I'll let you make your own decision, but you should have a look. But when I listen to The Big Bang and I listen to I Cry, they're very, very moving poems. You also change your delivery, which is very different than from what we've seen in this podcast. And I wanted you to comment on these poems and any other ones that you've done, because I found them so moving that I had to put this in the podcast. And I'd ask you to comment on your poetry and what I've said.
For me as a poet, one of the coolest things, Neil, is when somebody comes up to me, and this happens from time to time, they'll say, I'm not really into poetry. I don't really see what the big deal is, but I read your poem or I saw your poetry film and it completely changed my view of poetry. So it's a tall compliment, so thank you very much. You asked me something earlier, Neil. You said, what is my favorite poem of the hundreds of poems I've written? So I don't have a favorite, but I can tell you the most personal piece that I've written is called No Love to Be Won. And I'm honored that you will play it on your podcast. It's a tribute to my grandfather, Harry Wall, who passed away unexpectedly, much too young. And it deals with this tremendous, devastating loss, because I believe that our family collectively, not respectively, collectively we could never quite gather our bearings and our composure and reassemble our beliefs. And I believe my dad in particular carried a tremendous amount of pain and burden, guilt, and many toxic emotions that he had no business carrying, but he did, as is often the case. And so I wanted to write a poem to help him heal.
When I was 40 years old, my dad came to me and said, "Son, your dream is running out of time. You gotta let it go. Get on with the show while you still got time." I said, "Dad, I have an angel. He's just a little behind. He's working his way to the front of the line. He's gotta pull a rabbit out of the hat, I know, but he doesn't mind. Our watch is broke, but his runs in God's time." My dad said, "Son, you got no reason to hang your head. Most people with a broken leg, they just stay in bed. But you got up and tried." And then we both cried. We both cried. I said, "Dad, I feel like I'm getting close to a place that can free us both from the sadness that took us down to the joy we never found. Because, Daddy, it's so true that my dream was going to be my gift from me to you." And then my dad cried. He cried. And I asked him why. He said, "Son, I cry because my dream was also for my dad. For the time I never had. For the hero who hid his wounds. For the man who left me too soon. For the man I knew was the best. For the man I laid to rest." And we both cried. And we both cried. And then my daddy's dad appeared up in the sky. And we both looked up. He was alive. We tried to fight the tears, but we could only cry. And my grandpa said, "Jackie, don't be fooled. Your daddy never left. I've breathed with you in every breath. I covered you when you needed rest. I stitched you up when they broke your chest. I was there when there was nobody left." And he continued, "So boys, chase your dreams just for fun, because there's no love to be won between a father and his son. There's no kisses to be found. There's no clock to be wound. There's no victim to be crowned. Love is never lost, but it can be found. So boys, chase your dreams just for fun, because there's no love to be won between a father and his son."
You've been watching JWeekly Canada. For more info, go to jweekly.ca.